The smell of roasted turkey and rosemary usually brings back memories of my late wife, Martha, and the 30 years of quiet, happy Thanksgivings we shared in this house. But this year, the only thing I could smell was my own sweat and the metallic tang of fear. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, a place that used to command respect, but today I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. My right arm was encased in a heavy plaster cast, suspended by a black nylon sling that cut into the back of my neck. The pain was a rhythmic, throbbing beast, a constant reminder of the accident that had happened 48 hours prior. I looked down at my plate. Sarah, my only daughter, had piled it high with mashed potatoes and gravy, but she hadn't cut the meat. She knew I couldn't use a knife. She knew I could barely even grip a fork with my left hand without my tremors acting up. So I just sat there, hungry, watching the steam rise from the food while our guests, the Hendersons from down the street, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The silence was thick, suffocating, broken only by the clinking of silverware and the aggressive way my son-in-law, Silas Garrett, chewed his food. "Arthur, you're not eating." "Mrs." Henderson said, her voice trembling with a forced sweetness. She looked at my cast, then at Silas. "Is the pain too much?" I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her that the pain in my arm was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. But Silas beat me to it. He slammed his wine glass down on the table, the red liquid splashing onto the white linen cloth like a fresh wound. "He's just being stubborn, Diane," Silas said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He leaned back, his expensive suit jacket straining against his shoulders that were broader and stronger than mine would ever be again. The old man thought he still ran this house. He thought he could bark orders at me in front of Sarah. I just had to provide a little corrective feedback. "Isn't that right, Sarah?" I looked at my daughter, my little girl, the one I'd put through private school, the one I'd bought a condo for when she married this shark. She didn't look at me. She didn't even flinch. She just took a delicate sip of her Chardonnay and wiped her mouth with a silk napkin. "Silas just taught him a lesson, Diane," she said calmly, as if she were talking about training a disobedient dog. "Dad has a habit of forgetting that he's retired. He forgets that his time is over. Silas was just helping him transition into a more passive role in the family." The Hendersons froze. Mr. Henderson's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. They looked at the bruises on my face that the makeup Sarah forced me to wear couldn't quite hide. They saw the truth, but in the world of the elite Montgomery Heights district, you didn't interfere with family business. You just looked at your plate and prayed the violence didn't spill onto your porch. Silas chuckled, a dark, arrogant sound that vibrated in the room. He thought he was the boss here. I proved him wrong. Now he's going to sit there, stay quiet, and sign what he needs to sign. Right, Arthur? I looked Silas dead in the eye. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a grimace. I just smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent 35 years as a lead investigator for the United States Coast Guard. A man who had stared down smugglers, pirates, and storms that turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. I knew something Silas didn't. I knew that the doorbell was about to ring, and 10 minutes later, it did. The chimes echoed through the foyer, sharp and demanding. Silas's hand stopped midair. His eyes darted to the door, then back to me. He wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody came to the Miller estate without his express permission. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "Who the hell is that?" he hissed, looking at Sarah. She looked just as confused, her composed mask finally slipping. I didn't know it yet, I thought to myself, watching the panic begin to brew in Silas's eyes. But the storm I'd been tracking for 6 months had finally reached the shore. To understand how I ended up a prisoner at my own Thanksgiving table, you have to go back to May. You have to go back to the day the gift arrived. I was in my study, a room filled with the smell of old paper and salt air. My walls were lined with commendations from the Department of Homeland Security and framed charts of the Eastern Seaboard. I was retired, sure, but I still ran a small maritime consulting firm, Beacon North. I spent my days analyzing shipping manifests and insurance claims for cargo vessels. It kept my mind sharp. It kept the grief of losing Martha from pulling me under. Sarah and Silas had dropped by, unannounced. That was the first red flag. Silas usually only came by when he wanted to discuss an investment opportunity, which was his polite way of asking for a 6-figure loan to bail out his failing firm, Garrett Risk Management. Silas was an insurance broker by trade, but a gambler by nature. He liked the old money aesthetic of my life, but he had the new money desperation of someone who was always one bad month away from a foreclosure. "Dad, we have a surprise for you," Sarah said, sliding a cream-colored envelope across my desk. I opened it slowly. Inside were 3 tickets for a 14-day cruise on the Azure Sovereign, a luxury liner that specialized in ultra-exclusive Atlantic crossings. We're talking 5-star dining, private balconies, and a passenger-to-crew ratio that meant you never had to lift a finger. "The Azure Sovereign?" I murmured, looking at the departure date. "August. That's a hell of an expensive trip, Silas. I thought you said the Sterling Insurance merger hit a snag." Silas didn't blink. He sat in the leather chair opposite me, crossing his legs with a confidence that felt rehearsed. "Things turned around, Arthur. We had a great quarter. We wanted to show our appreciation for everything you've done for us. You've been cooped up in this house since the funeral. You need the sea air. It's in your blood, isn't it?" I looked at the tickets. Cabin 1012 and 1014. My cabin was a private suite with a wraparound balcony at the very aft of the ship. Isolated. Prestigious. Sarah leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Please say yes, Dad. Just the 3 of us. Like old times." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But my gut, the one that had helped me catch a dozen insurance fraudsters who thought they were smarter than the ocean, was screaming at me. Silas wasn't a gift giver. He was a taker. "I have a notary appointment in August," I said, testing the waters. I was planning on finalizing the Montgomery Trust and reviewing my estate's primary beneficiaries. "I'm getting older, Sarah. I need to make sure you're taken care of, but there are complexities." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. Silas's eyes locked onto mine. His pupils dilated just a fraction. He shifted his weight, and for a split second, the mask of the successful son-in-law cracked. "Estate planning can wait, Arthur," Silas said, his voice dropping into a smoother, more persuasive register. "The ocean won't. This specific itinerary only happens once every 5 years. You don't want to miss the midnight crossing near the Grand Banks. It's legendary for its clarity." "He's right, Dad," Sarah added, her voice a little too high, a little too breathless. "The notary will be there when we get back. This is about us, family." I looked from my daughter to the man who was slowly draining her soul and her bank account. I saw the way Silas's hand rested on the arm of the chair, his fingers drumming a frantic, silent rhythm. I saw the way Sarah wouldn't meet my eyes for more than 2 seconds. "Fine," I said, leaning back and letting a small, tired smile play on my lips. "I'll go. It'll be an adventure." The relief that washed over them was so palpable it was almost disgusting. They left shortly after, promising to send over all the boarding documents. But as soon as Silas's silver Mercedes pulled out of my driveway, I didn't go back to my manifests. I went to my safe. I pulled out a small, encrypted laptop I used for sensitive Coast Guard consulting. I began to dig. I started with Garrett Risk Management. Silas had told me business was booming. The public records told a different story. He was 3 months behind on his commercial lease. He had 4 outstanding civil suits from clients claiming he'd diverted premium payments into his personal accounts. He wasn't just struggling, he was underwater, he was drowning, and he was looking for a lifeboat. Then, I looked at the cruise, the Azure Sovereign. I pulled up the deck, plans for Deck 10. My cabin, 1014, was situated in a blind spot for the ship's standard security cameras due to the curvature of the aft hull. The railing on that specific balcony was scheduled for a safety retrofit in September because it was 3 inches lower than the maritime standard. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I sat there in the dark of my study, the only light coming from the glowing screen. I looked at the passenger list I'd managed to bypass. Silas had used a corporate credit card to pay for the tickets, a card that belonged to a holding company I'd never heard of. I didn't know what they were planning yet, but I knew the gift was a trap. They wanted me on that ship. They wanted me in that specific cabin, and they needed me to stay away from that notary. What happened next changed everything. 3 days before the cruise, I stayed up late, shadowing Silas's digital footprint. I found a life insurance application. It was for $5 million. The policy was a simplified issue whole life plan, the kind that didn't require a physical exam if the applicant was under 65 and had a clean medical history. The applicant was me. The beneficiary was Sarah Miller Garrett. And the signature at the bottom? It looked just like mine. The same looping A, the same sharp M. It was a masterpiece of forgery. The doorbell at the Thanksgiving table rang again, more insistent this time. Silas was halfway to the foyer, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked like a man who was watching his entire world catch fire. "Arthur," Silas whispered, turning back to me, his voice a frantic, desperate hiss. "What did you do?" I just sat there, my broken arm throbbing, and picked up my water glass with my left hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip. "I didn't do anything, Silas," I said, the weight of the last 6 months finally finding its voice. "I just told a few old friends from the Coast Guard that I was having a little family reunion, and they hate it when people miss their appointments." Outside, the flashing blue and red lights began to dance across the dining room walls, reflecting off the silver and the crystal, turning the Thanksgiving feast into a crime scene. Silas moved toward the back door, but I knew he wouldn't get far. My revenge had been 6 months in the making, and the first part of the bill was finally due. The heavy thud of Silas's boots hitting the hardwood floor echoed through the dining room as he scrambled toward the back kitchen entrance. He didn't even look back at Sarah. The elite businessman was gone, replaced by a panicked animal looking for a hole to crawl into. But he didn't make it to the laundry room. The back door swung open with a violent crack, and 2 men in tactical gear, U.S. Coast Guard police, stenciled in bold yellow across their chests, stepped into the light. Silas skidded to a halt, his hands flying up instinctively. Behind him, Sarah let out a thin, strangled scream, her wine glass finally slipping from her fingers and shattering against the floor. The Hendersons were frozen, Diane Henderson's mouth hanging open in a perfect O of suburban terror. "Silas Garrett?" the lead officer barked. "Stay exactly where you are." I sat perfectly still, watching the scene unfold like a movie I'd directed but was seeing for the first time. The adrenaline was numbing the ache in my arm. This moment, this beautiful, chaotic collapse had its roots in that humid week in August, the week we stepped onto the Azure Sovereign. 3 months prior, as I stood on the gangway of that massive ship, I felt like I was walking into my own coffin. I had the evidence of the forged insurance policy tucked away in an encrypted drive, but I needed more. I needed to know how far they were willing to go. I needed to see the mask slip in person. The first 3 days of the cruise were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Silas was unnervingly attentive. He walked me to breakfast. He sat with me on the promenade. He laughed at my old stories about the Coast Guard. But his eyes were always moving, scanning the deck, checking the height of the railings, noting the timing of the security patrols. He was an actuary calculating the probability of a tragic accident. Sarah was different. She was quiet, almost ghost-like. She spent most of her time behind oversized sunglasses, her skin turning a sickly pale despite the Caribbean sun. She was the weak link. I could see the guilt eating at her, but whenever she got close to saying something, whenever she looked at me with those watery eyes that reminded me of her mother, Silas would appear. He'd put a heavy hand on her shoulder, a loving gesture that looked more like a threat, and she'd shut down instantly. "Dad, you should come see the aft deck tonight," Silas said on the 4th evening, leaning over his lobster thermidor. "The moon is supposed to be full. The wake of the ship looks like liquid silver at 2 a.m. It's a photographer's dream." "I don't know, Silas," I replied, cutting into my steak with deliberate slowness. "The ocean at 2 a.m. is a lonely place. Very easy to lose your bearings." "Nonsense," Silas chuckled, though the sound didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be right there with you. I wouldn't want you missing the best view on the Atlantic." That night, I didn't go to the aft deck. Instead, I stayed in my cabin and did something I hadn't done in years. I set a trap. I'd spent 30 years investigating maritime disasters. I knew exactly how a slip and fall was staged. I moved a small, inconspicuous chair from my desk and wedged it under the handle of my balcony door. Then, I took a thin piece of fishing line, something I'd brought in my tackle box, and rigged a silent tell across the threshold. If anyone entered while I was sleeping, I'd know. I lay in bed, fully dressed under the duvet, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. The ship groaned as it sliced through the swells. Around 3:15 a.m., I heard it, a soft, metallic scrape, the sound of a master key card sliding into the lock of my balcony door from the outside. The door nudged against the chair. It stopped. Then, a low, frustrated whisper from the darkness of the balcony. "It's stuck. He must have locked the secondary latch." It was Silas. "Just leave it," a second voice whispered. "Sarah." Her voice was trembling so hard I could almost hear her teeth chattering. "Silas, please, not tonight. I can't. I can't watch." "Shut up, Sarah. If we don't do this before we hit the Grand Banks, the insurance won't pay out double for perils of the sea." "You want to lose the house?" You want to go to jail for the fraud I committed in your name? Because that's where we're headed." There was a long silence, broken only by the rushing wind. Then, the sound of the keycard being withdrawn. Footsteps retreated. I stayed in that bed until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the mattress. They weren't just waiting for an accident, they were trying to manufacture one. The next morning, I didn't confront them. I played the part of the frail, oblivious father. But I made a phone call from the ship's library using a secure satellite line. I called a man named Silas, feared but had never met. Elias Vane. Elias was my former protege, now a high-ranking investigator with the Coast Guard's Criminal Investigative Service. "Arthur, is that you?" Elias's voice was like an anchor in a storm. "Elias, I need a shadow," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder. "I'm on the Azure Sovereign. My son-in-law is trying to bury me at sea. I need you to track a man named Vinny Cordero. Silas has been calling him from the ship's Wi-Fi. I think he's the backup plan if the ocean doesn't take me. Say no more, Arthur. We're on it." "Where are you now?" "Heading toward the Florida coast. But Elias, there's something else. I think Sarah is being coerced, but she's in deep. I need a way to flip her before Silas realizes the walls are closing in." I hung up just as Silas walked into the library. He looked refreshed, as if he hadn't spent the night trying to break into my room to toss me overboard. "Ready for a walk, Arthur?" he asked, his smile wider than ever. "Actually, Silas," I said, standing up and feeling a strange, cold calm wash over me, "I've decided to change our itinerary. When we dock in Miami, I'm not going home right away. I've booked us a week at the Sterling Estate in the Keys. A little more family time before the notary meeting." Silas's eyes lit up. The Sterling Estate was a legendary piece of property. He saw dollar signs. He saw another chance. I saw a controlled environment where I could finally break them. Back in the present, in my dining room, Silas was being forced onto his knees. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced by a gray, waxy mask of terror. "Arthur, tell them," Silas screamed, his voice cracking. "Tell them it was an accident. The arm, I didn't mean to." "The arm wasn't an accident, Silas," I said, standing up from the table. The Hendersons were being escorted out by a female officer, Diane Henderson, sobbing into her husband's shoulder. I walked toward Silas, stopping just inches from where he knelt. "You broke it 3 days ago because I refused to sign the power of attorney. You thought if I was incapacitated, Sarah could sign for me. You thought pain would make me weak." I leaned down, the shadows of the room dancing in my eyes. "But you forgot one thing about the Coast Guard, Silas. We're trained to survive the wreck, and I've been documenting every single wave that's hit this family for the last 6 months." I looked at Sarah. She was slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't screaming. She was just gone. "What happened next?" I said, looking back at the lead officer. "Is the part where the hunter becomes the prey. Tell me, Elias, did you find the second forged policy? The one he took out on Sarah?" Sarah's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide, darting from me to Silas. "The what?" she gasped. Silas tried to lunge forward, but the officers slammed him back onto the floor. The look of betrayal that crossed Sarah's face was more satisfying than any legal victory. The open loop I'd planted months ago was finally closing, and the snap was going to break Silas Garrett's neck. I didn't know it yet, I thought, looking at my trembling daughter, but the real revenge hadn't even started. This was just the opening act. The silence that followed my revelation about the second insurance policy was heavier than the plaster on my arm. Sarah stared at Silas, her breath coming in short, jagged hitches. The man she had protected, the man she had allowed to brutalize her own father, was now revealed as the person who had placed a price tag on her own life. "A policy on me?" Sarah's voice was a ghost of a whisper. "Silas, what is he talking about?" Silas didn't answer. He was pinned to the floor, his cheek pressed against the expensive Persian rug, but his eyes were fixed on me with a primal, concentrated loathing. He knew the game was up. He knew that the loving husband persona had been stripped away to reveal the scavenger beneath. "Elias," I said, nodding to the lead officer. "Elias Vane. Show her the digital trail." Elias pulled a tablet from his tactical vest and swiped through a series of documents. He stepped toward Sarah, keeping a wary eye on Silas. "A $7 million accidental death and dismemberment policy, Sarah. Taken out 3 weeks after the cruise. The beneficiary isn't a trust, and it isn't your father." It's a shell company called Garrett Holdings based in the Cayman Islands. Silas is the sole director. Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the digital pages. She saw her own forged signature, a mirror image of the one Silas had used to sign my life away. The betrayal was a physical blow. She slumped back into her chair, the air leaving her lungs in a long, shuddering moan. I watched her, and for a moment, the investigator in me took a back seat to the father. I wanted to reach out, to tell her it would be okay, but I stopped myself. She had been a silent partner in my attempted murder. She had sat at this table and watched me suffer. The wound needed to be deep if it was ever going to heal properly. "You were the backup plan, Sarah," I said, my voice echoing in the vaulted dining room. If I survived the accident on the ship, or if I changed my will before he could finish me off, Silas needed a secondary source of capital to pay off the Blackwood family. "Isn't that right, Silas? Jax Blackwood doesn't like waiting for his money." At the mention of the name Blackwood, Silas's body went rigid. The color that had started to return to his face drained away, leaving him a sickly shade of parchment. To understand who Jax Blackwood was, you had to understand the underbelly of the Sterling district. While men like me built companies and lighthouses, men like Blackwood built empires out of debt and desperation. Silas hadn't just made bad investments. He had borrowed $4 million from a high-stakes offshore gambling syndicate to cover his losses at Garrett Risk Management. When the Sterling Insurance merger fell through, a merger I had quietly sabotaged from the wings, Blackwood's collectors started showing up at Silas's office with heavy shadows and sharp questions. "I didn't have a choice," Silas suddenly roared from the floor, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and pathetic self-pity. "They were going to kill us both, Sarah. I did it for us. I was trying to save our future. By killing me?" I stepped closer, the pain in my arm flaring as I loomed over him. "By planning to toss your wife overboard if the first payout wasn't enough. You didn't do this for us, Silas. You did this because you're a coward who couldn't admit he'd lost." I turned to Elias. "Take him out of here. I have everything I need for the deposition." As the officers hauled Silas toward the front door, he started screaming vile, incoherent threats that bounced off the portraits of my ancestors. Sarah didn't look up. She remained in her chair, surrounded by the wreckage of her life, staring at the shattered wine glass on the floor. Once the house was finally quiet, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock, I sat back down. I picked up a piece of cold turkey with my left hand and forced myself to swallow it. "Are you going to send me to prison too?" Sarah asked. She finally looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "That depends," I said. "It depends on how much you're willing to tell the district attorney about the night on the Azure Sovereign, and it depends on what you know about the notary Silas was supposed to bring over tonight." Sarah frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her face. "The notary? You mean Mr. Harrison?" "He's been Silas's family lawyer for years." I shook my head. "No, Sarah. Silas didn't call the Harrison firm. He called a man named Silas Vane, no relation to Elias, a specialist in creative documentation. I've been tracking his burner phone for 48 hours. He wasn't coming here to notarize a will. He was coming here to witness a confession." "A confession for what?" "A confession that I was the one who forged the insurance policies. A confession that I was suffering from early-onset dementia and had been embezzling from my own firm. Silas was going to use the pain of my broken arm and a heavy dose of the medication he's been slipping into your tea to make me sign a total transfer of assets." Sarah's hand went to her throat. "My tea? I've just been tired. I thought it was the stress." "Silas has been microdosing you with sedative hypnotics for months, Sarah. It's why you've been so passive. It's why you didn't fight back when he pushed me down those stairs 3 days ago." The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She stood up, her chair toppling over, and ran to the bathroom. I heard her retching, the sound of her body rejecting the poison Silas had fed her, both literal and metaphorical. I didn't follow her. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I'd memorized weeks ago. "He's in custody," I said when the person answered. "But we have a problem. Silas Vane is still in the wind, and I think he's carrying the original transfer documents. If those papers get filed before we can prove the coercion, the Montgomery estate goes into probate under Garrett Holdings. We lose the house, the firm, everything." "What happened next changed everything," the voice on the other end replied. "It was Jax Blackwood. I'd made a deal with the devil 3 days ago. To catch a shark like Silas, I'd had to invite an orca into the water. Blackwood didn't care about justice. but he cared about his $4 million. And he knew that if Silas went to prison, he'd never see a dime. "I've got my boys at the county line," Blackwood rasped. "Vane won't make it to the courthouse. But Arthur, remember our arrangement. Once the estate is secure, I expect my interest paid in full. I don't care if your arm is broken. I'll break the other one if you try to stiff me like your son-in-law did. The money is waiting for you in an escrow account, Jax," I said, my voice steady despite the cold sweat on my neck. "Just get me those papers." I hung up and leaned my head back against the chair. I was playing a dangerous game. I was using a criminal to stop a traitor, and in the process, I was risking the very legacy I was trying to save. Sarah came back into the room, wiping her face with a cold towel. She looked older, the youth stripped away by the horror of the last hour. "Dad?" she whispered. "What do we do now?" I looked at my daughter, the girl who had almost let me die. I didn't know yet if I could ever truly forgive her, but I knew I needed her. "Now," I said, "we go to the office." Silas left a digital back door open in his insurance software. "If we can get in there and freeze the Garrett Holdings accounts before Blackwood's men find Vane, we might just survive the night." But as we walked toward the garage, the doorbell rang again. This time there were no police lights. The street was dark. The air was silent. I opened the door, and my heart stopped. Standing on the porch wasn't Silas Vane or the police. It was a man in a sharp, gray suit with a face like hammered granite. He held a thick, manila envelope in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. "Mr. Miller," the man said, his voice as cold as a mountain stream. "Jax Blackwood sends his regards. But there's been a change in the interest rate. I didn't know it yet, but I had just traded one nightmare for something much, much worse. The cliff was crumbling, and the fall was only beginning. The man standing on my porch didn't look like a thug. He looked like a junior partner at a law firm, clean-shaved, hair perfectly gelled, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. But the way he held the silenced pistol was practiced, steady, and utterly devoid of hesitation. "Back inside, Mr. Miller." "Carefully," the man said. I retreated, my boots clicking on the marble tiles of the foyer. Sarah was still in the living room, frozen like a statue. When she saw the gunman, the towel she was holding slipped from her hand. "Sit," the man commanded, gesturing toward the sofa where Silas and Sarah had sat just hours ago. We sat. The house, which had felt like a fortress when the police were here, now felt like a cage. "My name is Silas Vane," the man said, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "Though I believe your daughter mentioned my reputation for creative documentation, I was supposed to be here at 6, but Jax Blackwood decided that waiting for the police to clear out would be more prudent." "You're the notary," I said, my voice sounding more certain than I felt. "I am many things, Arthur. Tonight I am the bridge between your survival and your estate's liquidation." He set the manila envelope on the coffee table. From it he pulled a stack of papers. "The transfer of assets to Garrett Holdings is already complete in every way that matters to the digital world. Silas Garrett may be in a cell at the Pinellas County Jail, but his shell companies are still very much alive. Vane, listen," I said, leaning forward. "Blackwood knows Silas won't pay him. That's why I made a deal with him." Vane smiled, a cold, thin line that didn't move his cheeks. "Jax appreciates your initiative, Arthur. But he also realizes that a man who can sabotage his own son-in-law is a man who might try to find a loophole in his interest payments. He's decided to expedite the process. These papers grant Blackwood's consultancy firm full power of attorney over Beacon North and the Montgomery Trust. And if I don't sign?" Vane raised the pistol slightly. "Then I shoot your daughter in the kneecap. Then I shoot you. Then I find your digital keys anyway. Dead men don't file injunctions." Sarah let out a sob, burying her face in her hands. I looked at the papers. My legacy. Everything I'd built to honor Martha, everything I wanted to use to help my fellow veterans, was about to be devoured by a loan shark. I didn't know it yet, I thought, staring at the pen Vane slid across the table. But the contingency plan I'd set up at the Tyrone Square Mall 2 days ago was about to be my only lifeline. I picked up the pen. My left hand was shaking, but I forced it to be steady. I began to sign. Not my name, but the specific looping forgery I'd practiced, the one that triggered a silent alert in the Beacon North security system. "Good," Vane said, watching the ink dry. "Now the accounts." He pulled out a laptop and turned it toward me. "Log in. Transfer the $4 million to the escrow account listed on the screen." As I typed, I saw a notification blink in the corner of the screen. GPS tracker active. Unit 04. Elias Vane and the team from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office weren't just monitoring Silas Garrett. They were monitoring the car Silas Vane had stolen to get here, a car I'd tagged while he was meeting with Silas at the mall. "The transfer is initiated," I said, hitting the enter key. "It'll take 20 minutes to clear the offshore firewall." "Then we wait," Vane said, settling into my leather chair. He looked comfortable. He looked like he owned the place. "Why, Silas?" Sarah suddenly asked, her voice cracking. "Why help a man like Blackwood?" Vane didn't even look at her. "Because men like your husband are predictable, Sarah. They lose, they panic, they die. Men like Blackwood are the weather. You don't fight the weather, you just make sure you have an umbrella." The 20 minutes felt like 20 years. Every tick of the grandfather clock was a hammer blow. Then, my phone sitting on the charger across the room, buzzed. Vane stood up, his eyes narrowing. "Don't move." He walked over and picked up the phone. His face went white. "What is it?" I asked. Vane turned the phone around. It was a live feed from the front gate. 3 black SUVs were pulling into the driveway, but they weren't police. They were marked with the logo of a private security firm, one I recognized instantly. "Blackwood?" Vane hissed. "No," I said, standing up, the pain in my arm forgotten as the adrenaline took over. "That's Sterling Security. They handle the armored transport for the Maritime Bank, and I just reported a $4 million unauthorized withdrawal. In about 60 seconds, this entire property becomes a federal crime scene, and the consultancy firm on those papers becomes the primary suspect in a grand larceny case." Vane raised the gun, his eyes wild. "You old fool, you just killed us both." "I don't think so," I said, pointing to the window. The night sky was suddenly illuminated by a blinding white spotlight from above. The rhythmic thwump 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 of a Coast Guard helicopter drowned out everything else. "This is the United States Coast Guard," a voice boomed from the sky. "Drop your weapon and put your hands behind your head." Vane looked at the ceiling, then at me. He realized he'd been played. He realized that an investigator who knows the ocean also knows how to bait a hook, but as he started to lower the gun, he did something I didn't expect. He lunged for Sarah. "If I'm going down," Vane screamed, "I'm taking the prize with me." I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to worry about my broken arm. I threw myself at Vane, the weight of my cast becoming a weapon I hadn't planned for. What happened next changed everything. I didn't hit him with my fist. I couldn't. Instead, I put every ounce of my weight and 30 years of bottled-up maritime grit into a leading shoulder tackle, swinging my heavy plaster cast like a medieval mace. The cast caught Silas Vane square in the jaw, just as his fingers tightened around Sarah's throat. The sound was sickening, a wet, muffled crack of bone meeting reinforced gypsum. Vane's head snapped back, his eyes rolling into his skull as he collapsed onto the mahogany coffee table. The glass shattered under him, 1,000 diamond-like shards biting into his expensive charcoal suit. The silenced pistol skittered across the floor, spinning like a top before coming to rest near the fireplace. The world exploded into motion. The front door, already weakened from Vane's entry, was kicked off its hinges by the Sterling security team. Almost simultaneously, the floor-to-ceiling windows in the dining room shattered inward as Elias Vane's tactical team repelled from the shadows of the porch. The air was suddenly thick with the smell of ozone, broken glass, and the deafening rhythmic wash of the helicopter hovering directly over my roof. "Clear! Clear!" "Suspect down." I was on the floor, gasping for breath. The pain in my broken arm now, a white-hot supernova that threatened to black me out. I looked over at Sarah. She was curled in a fetal position, sobbing hysterically, her hands clawing at the carpet. I wanted to go to her, but 2 officers were already pinning my shoulders back, their voices a blurred roar of commands. "Arthur! Arthur! Look at me!" It was Elias. He knelt beside me, his tactical helmet pushed back, his face a mask of adrenaline-fueled concern. He signaled the officers to release me. "You're okay, old man. You're okay. We got him." I looked over at Silas Vane. He was being rolled onto his stomach, his hands zip-tied behind his back. His jaw was hanging at an unnatural angle, blood leaking from his mouth onto my Persian rug. He wasn't the polished notary anymore. He was just another broken piece of Jax Blackwood's machinery. "The papers," I wheezed, pointing toward the wreckage of the coffee table. "The power of attorney," he made me sign, but I used the alert signature. Elias picked up the blood-stained documents. He scanned them, then looked at me with a grim nod. The signature triggered the flag at Beacon North, Arthur. The Maritime Bank froze the transit within seconds. Blackwood didn't get a dime. But he's going to be looking for his interest, and he's going to be looking for Vane. Let him look, I said, leaning my head back against the cold marble of the foyer. But as the paramedics began to load Silas Vane onto a stretcher and Sarah was led away to an ambulance for shock, the real horror of the night began to settle in. It wasn't the gunmen or the loan sharks. It was the realization that my house, my sanctuary, was now a hollowed-out shell. I sat on the bumper of a patrol car 20 minutes later, a heavy wool blanket draped over my shoulders. The Clearwater night air was cooling, but the humidity still clung to everything. Elias stood nearby, finishing a radio call. "Arthur," he said, walking over. "We have a problem." "Only one?" I asked, a bitter laugh bubbling in my throat. "Silas Garrett," Elias said, his voice dropping. "He's been in processing at the county jail for 4 hours. He just called for a private meeting with the district attorney. He's claiming he has evidence that you were the mastermind behind the Garrett risk management embezzlement. He's saying he was just the fall guy, and that the cruise was your idea to dispose of him because he knew too much." I stared at him, the blanket suddenly feeling like it was made of lead. "That's insane. I have the recordings. I have the evidence of the fraud." "He knows that," Elias replied, his expression unreadable in the strobe of the police lights. "But he's playing a different game now. He's claiming that the recordings were staged, that you're an expert in maritime surveillance, and you manipulated the audio to frame him. He's also turned over a set of bank statements from a hidden account in your name, Arthur. An account with $2 million in it that was funneled from Sterling Insurance over the last 18 months. The world tilted. $2 million? A hidden account? I don't have a hidden account, Elias, you know me. I do, Elias said softly, but the paperwork looks legitimate. It's got your social, your old Coast Guard credentials, and a series of digital signatures that trace back to your home IP address. If the DA buys this, they'll put a freeze on all your assets, including the Montgomery Trust. You won't just be a victim, Arthur. You'll be the lead defendant in a federal racketeering case. I looked toward the ambulance where Sarah was sitting, a medic checking her vitals. She was looking at me, her face pale, but there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just fear. It was a cold, calculating stillness. What happened next changed everything. Sarah stood up from the ambulance, waving off the medic. She walked toward me, her gait steady, her tears gone. She didn't look like a woman who had just been nearly strangled. She looked like a woman who had just finished a long day at the office. "Dad," she said, her voice eerily calm. "We need to talk. Privately." Elias glanced between us, his brow furrowed. He stepped back, giving us a few feet of space, but his hand stayed near his radio. "Sarah, what is this?" I asked. She leaned in close, the smell of her expensive perfume mixing with the scent of the salt air. "Silas is an idiot, Dad. We both know that. He was never going to pull off the cruise plan. He was too loud, too desperate." I knew that the moment we stepped onto the Azure Sovereign, my blood went cold. "You knew? I'm a Montgomery too, Dad. Did you think I inherited all my brains from Mom?" She smiled, a small, chilling expression that made my skin crawl. "I knew Silas was gambling with Blackwood's money. I knew he was forging your signature. But I also knew that if I played the victim, the scared, manipulated wife, you would do exactly what you did. You'd build a case. You'd bring in your friends from the Coast Guard. You'd do all the heavy lifting to get Silas out of the picture." "Sarah, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that the hidden account Elias mentioned, it's real. But it isn't yours, and it isn't Silas's. It's mine. I've been skimming from Silas's firm for 2 years. I used your credentials because I knew if things ever blew up, you'd be the perfect shield. Who's going to believe a decorated war hero and investigator is a thief? And if they do, well, Silas is already in jail and you're an old man with a broken arm and a history of memory lapses I've been documenting for your doctor." I felt like I was drowning in the middle of a calm sea, my own daughter, my only child. "You framed me," I whispered. "I secured our future, Dad. Silas was going to lose everything to Blackwood. I just made sure that when the dust settled, the money stayed in the family, specifically with me." She touched my cast gently, almost affectionately. "You should have just gone along with the cruise plan, Dad. It would have been quicker. Now, you're going to have to fight a federal indictment while I manage the Montgomery Trust. Silas is going to take the fall for the murder plot, and I'm going to be the grieving daughter who had to watch her father descend into criminality." I didn't know it yet, I thought, watching her walk back to the ambulance with the grace of a queen, But the hunter hadn't just become the prey. The hunter had been a decoy all along. Sarah turned back one last time, her silhouette framed by the flashing lights of the St. Petersburg police cruisers. "Oh, and Dad? Don't bother calling Jax Blackwood. I've already settled Silas's debt. With your money. Jax and I are on very good terms now. He doesn't like loose ends, and right now, you're the biggest loose end in the county." She stepped into the back of the ambulance and the doors slammed shut. I stood there, alone on the sidewalk of the house I'd spent my life defending. Elias was watching me, his face filled with a growing, professional suspicion. He'd seen the look on my face. He'd seen the way Sarah whispered to me. "Arthur?" Elias asked, stepping forward. "What did she say?" I looked at my broken arm, then at the house where Vane's blood was still staining my rug. I could tell him the truth, but would he believe me? Or would he see the bank statements Sarah had planted? The cliffhanger wasn't the gun or the loan shark anymore. It was the fact that the person I loved most in the world had just handed me a life sentence, and she was doing it with a smile. "She said she loves me." I lied, my voice cracking. "She said she's glad I'm safe." But as Elias led me toward a cruiser, not for protection this time, but for questioning, I knew that the real war was just beginning. I had the evidence to destroy Silas, but to destroy Sarah, I'd have to destroy myself. I didn't know it yet, I thought as the siren began to wail. But the only way to beat a Montgomery was to stop playing by the rules of a Miller. The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room at the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office didn't hum. They buzzed with a low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle the very marrow of my bones. I sat across from Elias Vane, the man I had mentored, the man who had looked up to me as a surrogate father for a decade. Now, he wouldn't even meet my eyes. He was busy flipping through a thick blue folder, the Miller case file. "Arthur, I want to help you," Elias said, his voice flat, professional, and terrifyingly distant. "But the DA is looking at these wire transfers. $2 million didn't just walk out of Sterling Insurance and trip into a private offshore account. It was moved using your administrative overrides from Beacon North, overrides that only you and the firm's lead technician possess. And your technician has been on maternity leave for 6 months. I told you, Elias. It was Sarah," I whispered. My voice felt like it was passing through sandpaper. She admitted it to me outside the house. "She's been skimming from Silas's firm and framing me for the fallout." Elias finally looked up, and the pity in his gaze hurt worse than the fractured radius in my arm. "That's a heavy accusation to level at your daughter, Arthur. Especially when she's currently at the hospital, under sedation, after nearly being murdered by your son-in-law's associates. The hospital records show she's been reporting your confusion and aggression to her therapist for nearly a year. She was trying to protect your reputation, Arthur. She didn't want to put you in a home." I felt the air leave the room. Sarah had played the long game. She hadn't just planted money, she'd planted a medical history. Every time I'd forgotten my keys or repeated a story about the Coast Guard, she wasn't just being a patient daughter, she was building a dossier of a mind in decline. She had turned my aging into a weapon. I didn't know it yet. I thought, watching Elias slide a confession form across the table, but I wasn't just fighting for my freedom, I was fighting for my sanity. I didn't sign. I wouldn't. They couldn't hold me forever without a formal indictment, but the damage was done. By the time I was released on a staggering bail paid for by a secret rainy day fund, Sarah didn't know about the world had moved on without me. My assets were frozen. My house was a crime scene under seal. My firm, Beacon North, had been placed under the temporary stewardship of Sarah Montgomery Garrett. I was 63 years old. I had a broken arm, a shredded reputation, and precisely $400 in cash in my wallet. I checked into a dingy motel off the Gandy Bridge, a place where the air smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. I sat on the edge of the saggy bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of the ocean pressing down on me. But then, I remembered the one thing Sarah didn't have. She had my money, my house, and my records. But she didn't have 30 years of maritime intelligence. She didn't know the ghosts I'd kept in my pocket from my days as a lead investigator. I didn't go to a lawyer. I went to a dive bar in Tarpon Springs called the Rusty Anchor. I was looking for a man named Silas Blackwood, no relation to Jax, though the name was a dark coincidence. Silas was a former tech specialist for the Navy who had retired after a disagreement with a JAG officer. He was the best digital scavenger on the Gulf Coast. I found him in a corner booth, hunched over a laptop that looked like it had been through a war. "Arthur Miller," Silas rasped, not looking up. "I saw you on the news. They're saying you've gone rogue. Embezzling from the elite?" "That doesn't sound like the man who pulled me out of that sinking trawler in '98. I'm being framed, Silas, by my own blood." Silas finally looked up, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. He saw the cast, the bruises, and the hollowed-out look in my eyes. He pushed his beer aside and cleared a space on the table. "Talk." I told him everything. The cruise, the forged policies, Sarah's confession, and the hidden account. Silas listened, his fingers tapping a rhythmic code on the table. When I finished, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered a plan. "If Sarah is as smart as you say, she didn't just move money. She moved data," Silas said. "But data has a smell. If she used your IP address to frame you, she had to be physically present at your house or use a remote desktop protocol, and RDPs leave a handshake on the server. If I can get into the Beacon North mainframe, I can find that handshake. The firm is under her control now," I said. "There are guards. Sterling security is all over the place. We don't need to go into the front door," Silas grinned, revealing a gold-capped tooth. "We go through the sea." I didn't know it yet, but the reversal was starting. My rock bottom wasn't a dead end. It was a foundation. 3 days later, under the cover of a moonless Florida night, we approached the Beacon North offices from the water. I was at the helm of a small, electric-powered skiff that made no more noise than a ripple. My arm was still in a sling, but I steered with the practiced ease of a man who had navigated the Florida Straits in 10-foot swells. The Beacon North building sat on a private pier overlooking the intracoastal waterway. It was a modern glass and steel structure that Sarah had recently redecorated with Blackwood's consultants. I saw them on the balcony, 2 men in dark suits. Smoking and looking bored, they were looking for cars in the parking lot. They weren't looking for a shadow in the water. Silas climbed the pilings with the agility of a spider, carrying a portable signal interceptor. I waited in the boat, the salt air stinging my lungs, my heart hammering against my ribs. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A text from Silas. "I'm in. You're not going to believe this." He scrambled back down a moment later, his face pale. We drifted away from the pier before he spoke. "Arthur, it's worse than you thought," he whispered as we reached the safety of the open channel. "Sarah isn't just skimming. She's selling. She's been using Beacon North's maritime tracking data to give Jax Blackwood the coordinates of uninsured cargo vessels, high-value shipments that disappear in international waters. She's not just a thief, Arthur. She's a pirate's quartermaster." The scale of the betrayal made me feel sick. She was using my life's work to facilitate high-seas robbery. She was risking the lives of sailors' men like the ones I had spent my life protecting. "And the hidden account?" I asked. "I found the handshake," Silas said, opening his laptop. "It didn't come from your house. It came from a penthouse at the Vinoy Resort in St. Pete, a suite registered to a Mrs. Harrison. That's Sarah's maiden name. She was moving the money while you were on the cruise, using a mobile hotspot to bounce the signal. But she made one mistake." "What mistake?" "She used the ship's Wi-Fi to check the transfer status. The Azure Sovereign has a high-security encrypted log for its VIP passengers. Because you were the primary on the cabin, I can access that log. I have her digital fingerprint, Arthur. It's a direct link between her, the money, and the sabotage of your firm." I looked out at the dark horizon. I had the evidence. But I knew that in Sarah's world, evidence could be bought, buried, or burned. I needed something more. I needed a way to draw her and Jax Blackwood into the open. I needed to make them think they had won so completely that they'd become careless. What happened next changed everything, I thought, watching the lights of the city fade behind us. Because I wasn't going to the police. Not yet. I was going to give Sarah exactly what she wanted, a final, uncontested surrender. I spent the next 48 hours in Silas's back room, crafting a message. I sent it to Sarah via a secure courier. It was a formal invitation to a meeting at the Montgomery family cemetery, the place where Martha was buried. I told her I was tired of fighting. I told her I would sign over the remaining trusts and the deed to the house in exchange for a monthly stipend and her mercy. I knew she wouldn't be able to resist. She wanted to see me broken. She wanted to stand over me in the one place I held sacred and watch me crawl. "I'm going," Sarah's voice crackled through my phone on Thursday morning. She sounded triumphant. "But Silas and I won't be alone, Dad. Jax wants to make sure there are no more surprises." "I understand," I said, my voice trembling with a fake, fragile desperation. Just bring the papers. I want this to be over. I hung up and looked at Silas. He was busy syncing the signal from the 6 hidden cameras we'd planted in the cemetery that morning. Is the feed live? I asked. Live and broadcasting to a private server, Silas said. But Arthur, Blackwood is dangerous. If this goes wrong, they won't just arrest you. They'll bury you next to your wife. I've spent 30 years in the storm, Silas, I said, picking up my Coast Guard cap and placing it on the table. I'm not afraid of a little rain. I didn't know it yet, but the reversal was about to hit its peak. The old man with dementia was about to show his daughter that some legacies aren't built on money, they're built on the truth. And the truth was about to become the loudest sound in the county. The silence of a cemetery at dusk is different from the silence of an empty house. It's a heavy, expectant quiet, flavored with the scent of damp earth and the irony of 1,000 lives reduced to granite and grass. I stood by Martha's headstone at Cedar Grove, my good hand resting on the cold marble. My broken arm was still in its sling, a dull ache keeping me tethered to the reality of what I had to do. I looked at the dates carved into the stone. Martha had been the compass of this family, the one who kept the Montgomery ambition from curdling into greed. Without her, the North Star had gone dark, and my daughter had wandered into the deep woods. The sound of car tires on gravel broke the stillness. 2 vehicles, a black SUV and Sarah's sleek, silver Mercedes. They stopped 20 yards away, their headlights cutting through the growing fog like the eyes of predators. Sarah stepped out first. She wore a sharp black trench coat and leather boots that clicked with clinical precision on the paved path. Behind her came Jax Blackwood, looking every bit the high society monster in a camel hair overcoat, his hands buried deep in his pockets. 2 of his men, broad-shouldered shadows in tracksuits, flanked them, their eyes scanning the tree line. A bit dramatic, don't you think, Dad? Sarah's voice carried through the air, crisp and cold. Meeting at Mom's grave? It's a bit beneath you. This is the only place where the truth still matters, Sarah, I said, my voice steady. I didn't look at her yet. I kept my eyes on Martha's name. Jack stepped forward, his face like a slab of weathered granite. Let's skip the poetry, Miller. You said you were ready to sign. My time is expensive, and your daughter tells me you've finally seen the light. I've seen plenty, Jax, I said, turning to face them. I've seen the coordinates Sarah's been feeding you. I've seen the manifests of the cargo ships you've been redirecting in international waters. It's a clever operation, using Beacon North's tracking software to find the ships with the smallest crews and the most valuable untraceable cargo. Sarah's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something fear or annoyance crossing her face. You've been busy, haven't you? Scavenging in the digital trash. It doesn't matter. You have no proof that holds up in court, and by tomorrow, Beacon North won't exist. It'll be a subsidiary of Blackwood's holdings. 35-7. I have the papers right here, I said, reaching into my coat and pulling out a thick manila envelope. The total surrender of the Montgomery Trust. The deed to the estate. Everything. I just want one thing in return. What? Jax asked, his hand twitching in his pocket. I want to hear you say it, Sarah, I said, stepping closer to her. I want you to tell me why. Why frame me? Why destroy the man who gave you everything? Was the money really worth more than the 30 years we spent together? Sarah let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound that would have broken my heart if I hadn't already heard it on a dozen secret recordings. 30 years, Dad? You were never there. You were always on a ship, or in a briefing room, or chasing some 2-bit smuggler. You didn't give me everything. You gave me a golden cage and a name that meant I had to be perfect while you were playing the hero. She stepped right into my space, her face inches from mine. The mask was completely gone now. The loving daughter had been replaced by a woman who had outgrown her conscience. Silas was a mistake, a show that broke in my hands. But Jax understands the world. We don't wait for things to happen. We make them happen. Framing you wasn't just about the money, Dad. It was about taking the power back. It was about showing you that the lead investigator could be fooled by the one person he was supposed to know best. And the piracy? I asked, looking past her to Jax. The men on those ships, some of them have families, Sarah. Some of them won't come home because of your coordinates. Collateral damage, Jax interjected, sounding bored. In the insurance world, we call that an acceptable loss. Now, sign the damn papers. He gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward with a portable LED light and a pen. I laid the envelope on the flat top of a nearby monument, the Miller family crypt. I didn't know it yet, I thought, my hand trembling as I gripped the pen. But the signal I was about to send wasn't just digital. It was a death knell for an empire. I signed the first page, then the second. Sarah watched with a hungry, triumphant intensity. She was so close to winning she could taste it. "There," I said, sliding the papers toward her. "It's done." Sarah snatched them up, scanning the signatures. "Finally." "You're smarter than I thought, Dad. You chose survival over pride." "Actually, Sarah," I said, leaning back against the cold stone of the crypt, "I chose the truth over everything. Do you remember what I told you about the Coast Guard? We never go into a storm without a backup plan." "What are you talking about?" Jax growled, sensing the shift in the air. "Silas Blackwood is currently in a van 500 yards from here," I said. "He's been live streaming this entire conversation to a private server. But he's not the only one watching. The Sterling District is a small world, Jax. Your rivals, the ones whose shipments you've been hijacking, they've been tuned in for the last 10 minutes. Jax's face went from granite to ash. What? "I didn't send the feed to the police first," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "I sent it to the Vane Syndicate in Miami. The ones you stole the Colombian emeralds from last month. I figured they'd be very interested to know exactly who was responsible for their uninsured loss." The sound of Jax's phone began to explode with notifications. His men shifted, their hands going to their waistbands. "You're a dead man, Miller," Jax roared, pulling a gun from his coat. "I don't think so," I said, pointing toward the cemetery entrance. A thunderous roar echoed through the trees as half a dozen blacked-out SUVs tore through the gates, their tires screaming on the gravel. They weren't police. They were a fleet of heavy-duty trucks with no markings. "That would be the Vane Syndicate," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They're not as patient as the Coast Guard. And they don't care about your lawyer, Sarah." Panic, pure and unfiltered, finally hit my daughter's face. She looked at the papers in her hand, then at the approaching headlights. "Dad, what have you done?" "I didn't do anything, Sarah," I said, walking away from the crypt toward the shadows of the old oaks. "I just followed the coordinates. You taught me how to do that, remember?" The cemetery erupted into chaos. Shoutings, the flash of gunfire, and the screeching of metal as the two factions collided. Jax and his men scrambled for their vehicles, but they were already boxed in. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the path, the surrender papers blowing out of her hands like dead leaves. I didn't stay to watch the blood hit the grass. I kept walking, my boots steady on the path, the sound of the battle fading behind me. I reached the perimeter fence where Silas Blackwood was waiting in his van. "Did you get it?" I asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. Silas looked at his monitors, his face illuminated by the green glow of code. Every word. Arthur. Her confession. Blackwood's admission of piracy. The whole thing. It's already in the hands of the Federal Maritime Commission and the DA. The Vane Syndicate is just cleaning up the local mess. "And Sarah?" Silas hesitated, looking at the thermal feed from the cemetery. "She's running, Arthur. She's heading toward the backwoods." "Let her run," I said, leaning my head back and closing my eyes. "She's a Montgomery. She thinks she can outrun the storm, but she forgets that the ocean always catches up." What happened next changed everything, I thought, as Silas put the van in gear and we pulled away from the carnage. Because the final twist wasn't about who went to jail or who died in a graveyard. It was about what I found in the second envelope, the one Sarah didn't see. I pulled a small, tattered photograph from my pocket. It wasn't of Sarah or Martha. It was an old black-and-white image of a man I hadn't seen in 40 years. My father, the man who had started the Montgomery Trust with a secret that had been buried for half a century. I looked at the back of the photo where a series of numbers were written in faded ink. I didn't know it yet. I whispered to the empty air. But the family legacy Sarah was so desperate to steal was built on a lie far bigger than anything she'd ever imagined. The true revenge wasn't over. It was only just beginning to reveal its teeth. The smoke from the shootout at the cemetery was still being swallowed by the Florida fog when the first real sirens, the blue and red of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, began to wail in the distance. The Vane Syndicate had vanished as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving behind a graveyard littered with Jax Blackwood's pride and a few of his more unfortunate associates. Jax himself had been dragged away in one of the unmarked SUVs. I didn't expect he'd ever be seen on the streets of the Sterling District again. I sat in the passenger seat of Silas Blackwood's van, the small, tattered photograph of my father heavy in my hand. The numbers on the back, a sequence of coordinates and an alphanumeric string, weren't just a code. They were a confession. "Arthur, you're shaking," Silas said. glancing at me as he navigated the van away from the chaos. "The paramedics said you're in shock. We should get you to a hospital." "No," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Take me to the St. Petersburg Museum of History, the archives." "The archives, now? Arthur, the police are going to be looking for you. You were at a shootout." "The police have the live feed, Silas. They have the confession. I'm not running. I'm just checking the ledger." I didn't know it yet, but the investigation of a lifetime, the one that would define every year I'd spent in uniform, was finally reaching its terminal point. We reached the archives just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the gulf in shades of bruised purple and gold. I used my old credentials to get the night watchman to open the maritime records room. I looked for the file on the SS Montgomery Star, the cargo vessel my father had captained in 1974, the ship that had famously gone down in a freak storm off the Cape Hatteras, taking 5 men with it and leaving my father a wealthy, retired hero. I pulled the microfiche and found the insurance settlement. The Sterling Insurance Group, the same firm Sarah had been trying to merge with, had paid out a record sum. I looked at the coordinates on the back of my father's photo. They didn't match the reported location of the wreck. They were 40 miles south, in a deep trench known for its shifting sands and lack of currents. The alphanumeric string was the account number for a Swiss trust, one that had been the foundation of the Montgomery fortune. "What did you find, Arthur?" Silas asked, leaning over my shoulder. "The truth," I said, my fingers tracing the grainy image of my father. "He didn't lose the ship in a storm. He scuttled it. He killed 5 of his own men for the payout that built the Montgomery estate. He wasn't a hero. He was the first pirate in this family. The irony was a physical weight. My father's crime had funded my education, my house, and my career as a man who hunted people exactly like him. Sarah hadn't wandered into the woods. She had simply returned to the family business. The Montgomery legacy wasn't built on salt and service. It was built on blood and insurance fraud. I didn't know it yet, I thought, looking at the evidence of my father's sin, but the final act of revenge wasn't going to be against Sarah. It was going to be against the very name I carried. I didn't have to wait long for the final confrontation. By noon, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office had located Sarah. She hadn't run far. She was found huddled in a storage unit she'd rented under her maiden name, clutching a laptop and a passport. I went to the station, not as an investigator, but as a ghost. They let me into the holding room because Elias Vane still believed in the man I used to be. Sarah sat behind the plexiglass, her sharp trench coat stained with mud, her hair a bird's nest of tangles. When she saw me, her eyes didn't fill with tears. They filled with a cold, desperate heat. "You think you won, don't you?" she spat, her voice echoing in the small room. "You think because Jax is gone, I'm done? I have lawyers, Dad. I have offshore accounts you couldn't find with a map and a flashlight." "I found the map, Sarah," I said, sliding the black and white photo of my grandfather against the glass. I turned it over so she could see the numbers. She frowned, her brow furrowing. "What is this?" "This is the reason you're never getting out of here," I said. "Those coordinates are the actual location of the SS Montgomery Star. I've already contacted the Coast Guard recovery team. They're sending a submersible down this afternoon. They're going to find the hull, Sarah. And they're going to find the evidence that the valves were open from the inside." Sarah's face went white. "That was 50 years ago. What does that have to do with me?" "Everything. Because the Montgomery Trust, the one you fought so hard to steal, is the fruit of a poisonous tree. Under federal law, if the foundation of a trust is proven to be criminal, the entire asset pool is seized by the government to pay restitution to the victims' families. In this case, the families of the 5 sailors your grandfather murdered." I leaned in, my face inches from the glass. "By the time your lawyers get to court, there won't be a Montgomery estate, there won't be a Beacon North, there won't be a penny left for your bail or your defense. You're not just going to prison, Sarah. You're going there as a pauper." The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the photo, then at me, and for the first time in her life, I saw her realize that she was small. "Dad," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "You can't. You'll lose everything too. The house, your pension. You'll be on the street." "I've spent most of my life on the water, Sarah," I said, standing up. "I'm comfortable with nothing but the horizon. I'd rather be a miller with a clean conscience than a Montgomery with $1 million and a heart like yours." I walked out of the station and didn't look back. What happened next was the slow, methodical dismantling of a lie. The submersible found the ship. The forensic team confirmed the sabotage. The federal government moved in with the efficiency of a shark, freezing every account, seizing the estate, and dissolving the Montgomery name into a series of court-ordered reparations. Silas Garrett was sentenced to 30 years for his role in the murder conspiracy and fraud. Sarah received 25, the judge citing her extraordinary coldness and lack of remorse as a factor. Silas Vane, the notary, took a plea deal and became the primary witness in the racketeering case against Jax Blackwood's remaining associates. As for me, I sold what was left of my personal belongings, the things that hadn't been bought with Montgomery money. I moved into a small, one-bedroom cottage in Dunedin, overlooking the marina. My arm eventually healed, though the bone would always ache when a storm was brewing. 1 year later, on Thanksgiving, I didn't sit at a mahogany table. I sat on a wooden bench at the end of the pier, a simple turkey sandwich in my hand. The ocean was calm, a vast, blue expanse that didn't care about trusts or legacies or revenge. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Elias Vane. The Coast Guard Veterans Fund received the final distribution from the trust today, $1.2 million. You changed a lot of lives, Arthur. Happy Thanksgiving. I looked out at the water. I had lost my house, my daughter, and my fortune. But as I watched a Coast Guard cutter cruise slowly past the harbor, the crew standing tall on the deck, I realized I hadn't lost my soul. The moral of the story, I suppose, is something I should have learned a long time ago. The sea doesn't keep secrets forever. It eventually brings everything back to the surface, the wrecks, the treasure, and the truth. And if you're lucky, you're still standing on the shore when it does. I stood up, adjusting my cap against the salt breeze. I wasn't an investigator anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was just a man named Arthur, and for the first time in 63 years, I was finally free of the tide. I turned away from the water and started walking home. The sun was setting, but the path was clear. I didn't know it yet, I thought, a small, genuine smile finally finding its way to my face. But the best part of the story isn't the ending, it's the silence that comes after the storm.